Okay, I guess I'll just get started. Is everyone able to hear me? Well, can you just give a thumbs up or something so I know that you guys can hear me? Okay, awesome. All right, let's get started. Uh, Welcome everyone to PreMed 101 for the 24-25 cycle. This session will be in English, unfortunately, but if anyone would like me to translate something in Arabic, I can gladly do that, but for the purposes, this session will be in English. Okay, let's get started. So, all right, here we go. So what we're going to be talking about today, just a brief introduction. We're going to talk briefly about the Canadian medical school admission process and how it works. We'll then move on to talk about the MCAT and the CASPER. We're then going to do a very deep dive into each Canadian medical school here in Canada. I'm going to talk about the extracurriculars and what you should be looking for. Then we're going to be speaking about the application itself and the interviews that come after the applications. Then I'm going to very briefly talk about international and U.S. medical schools and dentistry schools and their applications. And finally, I'll just quickly end with some frequently asked questions and bust any myths that surround the medical school application process. So to start off by introducing myself, my name is Amr AlMasri. I graduated high school in Mississauga, so I'm actually a John Fraser alumni. Graduated in 2019. I went to Saskatchewan for my undergraduate, where I studied the Bachelor's of Science in Kinesiology, and that was an honors degree. I did that for 4 years, graduated in 2023. Sorry, I kind of blanked out there. Let me see if I can actually have a. Oh, here we go. I have a laser pointer. And then I took a gap year where I went to the U of A in Edmonton, Alberta, where I did some school after I graduated. So that was a special year. But I also mainly worked at Rogers Centre. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Rogers Centre, where the Edmonton Oilers play. And then I just got admitted to McMaster at the Niagara campus, and I was waitlisted at Queen's University. So I was a third-time applicant, finally made it through, got admitted to McMaster, which I'm very fortunate and feel very privileged, and I'm looking forward to attending their university. So to talk about the Canadian medical schools and how do they work exactly, it's important to take a step back and take a look at the timeline, what a typical timeline one might expect for a person who is looking to get into medical school. So it really starts off right here in high school, which usually takes 4 years. And then when a person goes to get their bachelor's degree, so university undergraduate degree, which usually takes 4 years. Some schools do allow you to apply in your third year. So 4 years, give or take 1 year. And then you get into medical school itself, which takes another 4 years. So some medical schools are only 3 years, and we'll talk about that later. And then you start your residency, which is essentially your specialization. But in reality, if we're talking about how some schools allow you to apply in your third year and get accepted in your third year, and then some schools are only 3 years themselves, then in reality, it can take a minimum of 6 years for a person to become a fully licensed doctor, which is very comparable to the European system or the system that a lot of us Middle Easterns are used to. We're used to a person going into medical school after high school graduation, it taking them 6 years and then they specialize. But in Canada, it usually does take around 8 years. So 4 years of undergraduate and then another 4 years of medical school. But that's not the only timeline. You don't necessarily have to take 6 years or 8 years. Some individuals take a gap year where after they graduate, they do not go into a master's program or a PhD program, but rather just take a gap year where they could be working on research, could be working on themselves, traveling, or just not doing anything. So that could take an extra 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, where they keep on applying every year, but they're essentially taking a gap year and then getting into medical school. Another case would be where a person takes 5 years to complete their university degree. We're often told that we need to finish our degree as quick as possible, but sometimes other circumstances come up where it forces the person to take an extra year in their undergraduate degree, or other times they do just not want to be taking 5 courses and wanting to do 4 courses per semester, which then results in them having to take an extra semester or an extra year before getting into medical school. And even then, after that, they could take another gap year, 1 or more gap years, and then get into medical school. Or a person might decide that they want to do your university degree, which is 4 years. Then they decide they wanted to do a master's or a PhD, which can take 1 to 2 years for a master's, or 4 years if they want to get into, if they're in a PhD program. And then they decide to want to get into medical school. And what I really mean by that is there's no set timeline that a person can take or should take if they want to get into medical school. Speaking from my own experience, it took me 4 years of undergraduate degree, and then I took a gap year, and then I got accepted into medical school. I have some friends who got to the PhD stage and realized that they wanted to get into medical school, flip their lives around, quit their jobs, and then they decided they wanted to apply to medical school. And then there are other individuals who may have been working for 10 years or 20 years, and then they decided they wanted a career change and then got into medical school. Oh, and by the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to send it in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. So talking more about the admissions timeline, unlike the US system or perhaps any other country, there's no centralized application portal. So there's no one website that you can go to and you can apply to all the medical schools in Canada. Other than Ontario, through the Ontario Medical School Application Service or system, OMSAS as it's called, each school has its own application portal and deadline. So for example, OMSAS opens in early July and closes in October 1st. UBC, for instance, opens in late June or early July and closes at September 13th. U Alberta opens in July 1st, it closes October 1st, and so on and so forth. And so one needs to be cognizant of when the timelines are so that you do not miss any important deadlines, such as releasing your MCAT scores or your CASPER scores, and that you're submitting the application on time. And interviews are usually in late January to about early March, and then decisions are always at around mid-May. And I'll talk more about that with every school later on. And I really want to reiterate the fact about to always double check your dates, because I once forgot and it cost me a whole year. So I'm not sure if you're able to read the pictures there, but for University of Saskatchewan, they wanted us to release our MCATs between October 11 and October 21. And even though I released them earlier when I submitted my application, they wanted me to release it again, and I did not read that deadline. And as a result of that, my application was thrown out immediately after I submitted it, and I can no longer apply because my MCAT scores were not released to USask during the specific time period. And that's why I really like to reiterate the fact that to always double check your dates and make sure that you know what timeline that each school has and when they want you to release the MCAT dates, the CASPER, when you should be doing it, when your application is due, etc. And again, I'll be talking more about deadlines in the upcoming slides. Other dates to keep in mind is when to take summer classes or if you need to take summer classes. And what I mean by that is some schools require you to take 42 classes before you graduate. And so if we're talking about 5 classes per semester, that leaves you with 2 classes that you need to do. Some individuals opt to take 6 by 6 in 1 year or do 6 classes in 1 semester in 3rd year and another 6 classes in 4th year. Or other individuals like me decide to take 2 summer classes in your first summer and get them over with. So you need to be aware because what the other deadlines you need to take into consideration is when to write your MCAT. Most people, again, and I'll talk about that more later, opt to do their MCAT between the 2nd and 3rd year, the summer or between the 2nd year and the 3rd year. Others like to do it the year after, so in the summer between their 3rd year and their 4th year. You also need to take into consideration when to write your CASPER. For instance, University of Saskatchewan usually wants people to do their CASPER by the end of September. Other schools might allow you to take your CASPER at the end of December. So if you're applying to Saskatchewan, you might want to take your CASPER very early on so that you're able to hit that deadline and not miss out on it. Other dates to keep in mind is that if you're applying to dentistry, when do you want to take your DET? So if medicine is your first priority and the and dentistry is your second, is your backup plan, Do you want to focus more on your MCAT and then save the DAT for a later date? If you're applying to the S, there's another test called the preview, which is similar to CASPER. You also want to keep in consideration when do you want that, when do you want to do that test so that you can have that deadline in mind. So again, dates. They're super important to make sure that you're aware of them and what they are. So talking more about the MCAT and the CASPER. To talk more about the MCAT, for those who are unfamiliar, it's also known as the Medical College Admission Test, and it consists of 4 sections: biology and biochemistry, chemistry and physics, essentially, and then psychology and sociology. And the final, and the final section is the critical analysis and reasoning skill. And the CARS section is usually the section that most people get hung up on because it's the one section that you can't easily prepare for and is the one that really rigorously tests your English tests and your ability to read and answer questions about different passages in philosophy and politics and economics, because it's not a section that you can memorize. You're essentially required to read a passage and answer questions, versus the other 3 sections where you can memorize the Krebs cycle, you can memorize the biochemical facts, you can memorize the physics equation, but you can't memorize how to read a philosophy passage, for instance. And each section is marked from 118 to 132. And the maximum combined score is 528 and the minimum is 472. So the best score a person can get is 528, and the worst score you can get is 472. It's not a 0 to 100. But the scores are scaled. So what essentially that means is they look at how many questions you did well on and how many questions everyone got correctly. And they give you a mark that is relative to how well everyone did. So if everyone did really, really bad, then you doing, how to essentially phrase this, there's 53 questions in every section. If everyone got 25 questions right out of the 43 questions, your mark is based on how well you did out of 23. You don't need to get 53 out of 53 to get 132. You can do, if the exam is usually very hard, it doesn't take much for you to get a high mark in that section. And that's how the MCAT is scored. It's a scaled score and not a raw score. And it usually takes around 7.5 hours to complete. And that usually freaks out people because it is a very long test and you need to mentally prepare yourself to be in a test that will take you the whole day to complete. But there are breaks in between and you'll learn more about that when you actually start preparing for the MCAT. It's not available all the time, so you need to book ahead of time at the specified times and date. So usually the AAMC, which is the organization that sets up the MCAT, will let people know ahead of time that these are the available dates that we're offering the MCAT at these specific locations. And it is your duty as an applicant to find the best time for yourself and then sign up for that date. And that usually most people like to book their exams 3 to 4 months in advance. That gives them a good amount of time to study for it. And you can obviously change and rebook it if you don't feel confident in taking the exam at the time you booked. It is an in-person exam, so gone are the days where you can do it online, but it is now an in-person exam. And it costs about $500 to actually do the exam. But there is a fee waiver program that you can sign up for. You can just go to their website. There's usually a form that you fill out about your income, some forms you need to submit, but you can get that fee waived if you're of low socioeconomic status, if you're unable to pay for it. And the scores are usually valid for 3 to 5 years, but that is very school dependent, and each school may allow you to take your MCAT very early on. I personally took the MCAT between the summer between my second year, so I just finished my second year, but before starting my third year. That's when I took my MCAT. And that was good enough for 5 years for most schools. Just to keep talking more about the MCAT, it is used by most Canadian medical schools as part of their admission process. Other than Ottawa, TMU, which I'll talk about later, and most Quebec schools, these schools do not require the MCAT, but for most other medical schools in Canada and the US, most of them require the MCAT for now. And the weight of the MCAT in the admission process is the thing that changes from one school to another. So some schools, like McMaster, for instance, only looks at one specific section, which is the CARS. And that is usually worth around 33% of your pre-admission criteria. So when deciding who gets an interview or not, 33% of that equation is determined by your CARS score versus U of T, which uses the cutoff. So as long as you meet that specific section score, which is usually 124 or 125, sorry, doesn't matter how well you do, whether that's 126, 125, 132, as long as you meet the cutoff, you're good to go. Or Saskatchewan, for example, which uses it competitively. So it looks at your whole score, and the better your score is, the better you'll do in their admission, in terms of their admission criteria. And again, I'll talk more about that for each school specifically. So what does that mean to you? Or what does that mean when I talk about competitively, or when I talk about threshold, or when I talk about cutoffs? So cutoffs are all applicants who meet the threshold are treated equally. So like I mentioned earlier, in U of T, for example, the cutoffs are a minimum of 125 in at least 3 sections, with 124 allowed in 1 section. So if a person gets 129 in all sections, are treated equally, are treated the same way a person who got 125 in all other sections, right? There's no difference in score as long as you meet the cutoffs. And one thing to keep in mind is for non-Ontario schools specifically, there's something called the out-of-province and there's the in-province. So in-province are usually people who have lived in that province for a long while and are considered residents of that area. Their cutoffs are usually way lower than the out-of-province applicants. And again, I'll talk more about that later on. But the other way that the MCAT can be used is competitively. So generally, a low cutoff is placed. So for example, 492 for Saskatchewan. So you need to get a minimum of 492. But the higher the person's score is, the more favorable they are as an applicant. So a person who got 520 is a better applicant than a person who got 510, who is a better applicant than a person who got 495, for instance. So each school looks at the MCAT differently. Talking more about the CASPER, though, CASPER, and I'm sure some of you guys have heard it, it's a situational judgment test and an ethics test. Basically, you're provided with scenarios, or it consists of 14 questions, also known as scenarios. 9 of them are video response questions, and the remaining 5 are text response question. A video response question is a question where you need to physically talk to a camera and answer speak for 1 minute in response to a question. And the text response is you need to actually type out an answer to a given question. So there are 14 questions. Usually they're about a scenario. For example, you have a friend who is not doing well and you notice that they're not doing well on the exam. What would you do? Or you're in a group where one person is not participating well or is not helping out the group. How would you approach this scenario? And this is essentially what the CASPER test is. And the goal of the test is to test your social intelligence and your professionalism, especially in areas in the ethics, empathy, problem solving, and collaboration. You're not actually given a score when you complete the CASPER, but you are given a quartile. So you're given a range of how well you did. So if you receive the first quartile, which is usually the worst score, it means that you did better than a maximum of 25% of the test takers. So you did better than 25% of people. If you got in the fourth quartile, which is usually the best score, it means that you did better than 75 to 100% of individuals. You're at the top of the top. So you are not given the actual score, but the schools, the medical schools themselves, are given your actual score. You, as an applicant, only get a range. And you can also be placed in the second or the third quartile, which means that you did just about either below average, average, or above average compared to the rest of the test takers. So just something to keep in mind. Some schools use it competitively. So again, the higher the score, the better you'll do as an applicant. Others just have it as a requirement. So you just need to do it, but it's not actually used competitively. Others do not require it at all. So again, for example, McMaster uses it very competitively during its pre-interview screening. So like I mentioned at CARS, they use 33% of their pre-interview criteria for CARS. The other 33% is CASPER. So how well you do on CASPER determines whether you will get an interview or not. Versus U of A, which uses it not competitively. So they just want you to do the test. It doesn't matter how well you do. You usually just need to do like about average or just below average. They don't want a total sociopath to get accepted. And the UFC does not require it at all. So University of Calgary does not require it at all. And sorry, the U of A is the University of Alberta. I should make it clear. It is available in French and English, but you're only required to write it once. So either in English or in French. Most people opt to write it in English as the French schools do accept it, but again, there are exceptions, and we will talk about that later. The one thing to note with Casper versus the MCAT is that you can only write it once per year, and you can only write it after you submit your application, or at least one application. Versus the MCAT you can write it as many times as you want. Well, technically, you can only write it 5 times in your lifetime, or sorry, 7 times in your lifetime. Double check that number. But you can write all 5 times in the same year. You can write 2 in one year, 3 in the next year if you decide to do so. But the Casper, you're only allowed to write it once per year. You can't write it more than 1 time a year. And you can only do it after you submit an application, because they'll give you a specific code that the Casper website asks you to put in. So after you submit your application, you'll get a reference number that you can then take to Casper website. You'll put it in, and then it allows you to book your Casper date. So let's now deep dive into every Canadian school. So this is going to be, this might take a long time, so strap in, make sure you're comfortable. So to start off, I'm going to be talking about the Ontario medical schools, which is what I'm assuming most people are here for. To start with the McMaster University, the university I'm going to. It's one of the 2 3-year programs in Canada. So there's 2 medical schools in Canada that offer 3-year medical program, and that is McMaster and the University of Calgary. And I'll talk about Calgary later on. So it's a 3-year program versus 4-year program. You don't get the summers off, but you do finish in 3 years. They have 3 campuses in Hamilton, in Niagara, and in Waterloo. So I'm going to the Niagara campus. There's usually around 200 spots offered annually. And one thing to keep in mind is that most schools, especially Ontario schools, often get around 6,000 applicants for their medical schools. So we're talking about 200 people out of 6,000 people who get in. They do have an Ontario bias. So what that means is that if you live in Ontario, most of the spots are offered to Ontario students. It is easier for you as an Ontario resident to be accepted into McMaster versus a student who's coming from Alberta or is coming from British Columbia. You can apply to McMaster in your 3rd year. So once you start your 3rd year of university, you can apply to be admitted into McMaster for the following year. So you'll finish 3 years of university. You don't have to finish your degree to get accepted into McMaster, but you can apply in your 3rd year, get accepted, do 3 years in McMaster, boom, you're a doctor in 6 years. In terms of what they look for to get an interview at McMaster, they look at 3 things only. They look at your CARS. So the minimum they ask for is 123 in CARS, but usually you need a 129 on average to get an interview and to be accepted. You need 33% of it is your GPA. So they ask for a minimum of 3.0 out of a 4, but usually the average is 3.9, which is pretty high. And then the other 33% is your CASPER score. Usually they don't tell you what the actual score is, but it's been reported that you need a minimum of a 3rd quartile or a 4th quartile to actually be admitted. So if you have a low CARS, you need to make that up with either your marks or your CARS or your CASPER. If you have a low CASPER, then you need a really high CARS and really high GPA to make up for that. But it is arguably the easiest school to get into if you can do well on CARS and CASPER, because they do not look into extracurriculars at all. It doesn't matter if you've never been in a club. It does not matter if you've done any research. As long as you have the academics, which is your CARS, your GPA, and your CASPER, you can get into McMaster. But again, that's easier said than done. Talking about the University of Toronto, it is a 4-year program. There's around 206 spots offered annually. The thing to note, though, is it also accepts international students. There's 2 spots usually reserved for international students. The campuses are in Toronto and Mississauga. They don't have Ontario bias, so anyone in Canada can apply to the University of Toronto Medical School and will be treated equal to that of a person who has lived in Mississauga, let's say, for their whole lives. You can also apply to the U of T in your 3rd year, and they do have prerequisites. So you need to take 4 classes in life sciences, and they loosely define what a life science is, and you can check out the specifics in their website. And you need to take 2 classes in humanities, social sciences, or language. So you can take French and art history, for example. That's what I took. Other people can take psychology and sociology, for example. So you need to do these prerequisites in order to be accepted into U of T. And they have a very low MCAT cutoff. So you need to get 125 in at least 3 sections and 124 in at least 1 section in order to be admitted into University of Toronto. But again, that if you get a 132, if you get a 129, if you get a 125, as long as you meet the cutoff, you will be treated as equal to those who have gotten the higher scores. The good thing about the University of Toronto is CASPER is not required, so you don't need to do the CASPER test if you're looking to apply. But they do require 3 essays, and one of them is about a personal activity of your choosing. So you'll give them a list of your extracurriculars, all the things that you've done, and I'll talk more about the extracurriculars later on. So you'll tell them, I was in the science club, I was doing research, blah, blah, blah. And you need to expand more in a 500-word essay about one of these activities. The minimum GPA to apply is 3.6 for undergraduate applicant or 3.3 for graduate applicants, but usually the average accepted is 3.95 plus, which is higher than McMaster's admission GPA. So keep that in mind. To talk more about Queen's University, it is a 4-year program, around 100 spots offered annually in Kingston, Ontario, which is around 3 hours away from Mississauga if you live in Mississauga. It does not have Ontario bias, so similar to U of T, you can apply as a 3rd-year student, and there's no prerequisites, so you do not need to take any specific classes in order to be accepted into Queen's. CASPER is required. They do not mention it, but it is presumed that CASPER is heavily used in their admission criteria. But again, and then I'll talk more about that because they have changed the way that they look at individuals, and it does look into extracurriculars. So what activities you did will matter, will help them decide whether you get an interview or not. This year, though, they changed into a new lottery system. And the new lottery system is, as long as you meet the minimum requirements, which is a 3.0 GPA, 125 in all sections of the MCAT, and the CASPER, but they do not mention how well you need to do on CASPER, you will be put into a lottery. And then that will decide whether you get an interview spot or not. So before, for example, last year, who got an interview was dependent on what their GPA was, what their MCAT was, and what their CASPER was, and their extracurriculars. But this year, they're testing a new lottery system where if you meet the cutoffs, it's going to be a draw whether you get an interview or not. And then successful interview applicants, MMI applicants, were then invited for a panel interview. And I'll talk more about the MMIs and the panels later on. There's a separate lottery for individuals of low socioeconomic status. So if you're a person whose family is of a low socioeconomic status, there's a separate stream to help you get into medical school based on the challenges that you face. But Queen's also offers a specific program called the Queen's Lakeridge Family Medicine Program. And that is a separate program from the Queen's medical degree program. You're in both of them, you're still a doctor, but this one focuses more on people who want to pursue a career in family medicine. And so they're the same requirements, same steps, but they're a separate admission process. And that separate admission process is usually less busy because not everyone wants to get accepted. Not everyone wants to become a family doctor. But if you're a person who knows 100% that you want to enter family medicine, then the Queen's Lakeridge program is a good avenue to explore if you know for a fact that you want to get into the family medicine program. But keep in mind that you cannot apply to both programs. You either need to choose the Queen's Lakeridge program or the regular MD program. You must choose one. If you do not get accepted into the Queen's Lakeridge Family Medicine program, I do believe they mentioned that you can still be accepted into the MD program, but they're a bit vague when it comes to that. Talking about the University of Western Ontario, or like some people like to call Western, it's a 4-year program. They have both campuses in London and in Windsor, Ontario. There's around 170 spots offered annually. There's no Ontario bias per se, but they have specific streams for individuals who have lived in southwestern Ontario. So if you lived in the London area, they do have a specific preference for individuals who've lived in these areas. And you can apply to Western in your third year as well. There's no prerequisites, and the minimum to apply is 3.7, but usually the average accepted is around 3.93 out of a 4 scale. The good thing about Western Ontario is that they do look at your best 2 years. But in order for them to look at your best 2 years, these 2 years need to be years where you've taken both full-time studies, and they need to be a year where most of the classes you took were at the same year or above. So what I mean by that is if you're in your second year, for example, most of your classes need to be at a level of second year, so 200 level or higher. It can't be most of your classes being first year classes, even though you're in second year. If you're in third year, for example, most of your classes need to be in third year level or above in order to be considered part of the best 2 years. In terms of the MCAT, you need a minimum of 127 in all sections, but they do allow for the psychology and sociology section to be 126. CASPER is not required for this school, and they heavily look into your extracurriculars, and they require essays that expand on them. So last year, they used to require 9 essays in 5 different categories. So you would pick extracurriculars that you would expand in around 500 words or so. But this year, they're only requiring 4 essays in 4 different categories. So look at that there. It's way less work for people now. And they have a specific stream for individuals who face socioeconomic challenges, if you have a disability, if you're underrepresented in medicine, and more. And that comes with flexibility in scores and GPA. So you don't need to you don't need to have as high of a GPA or as high of an MCAT score if you're in these specific streams. And if you want more information, you should check out their website because that has way more information that I could put in these slides. In terms of Ottawa University, again, it's a 4-year program. They do offer it in both English and French. There's around 150 spots offered. 2/3 of these spots are offered for their English program because they do, again, provide education in English and in French, but 2/3 of that is for their English program. The campus is in Ottawa. And unfortunately, though, they recently introduced the Ottawa regional preference. So you need to have been graduated high school in Ottawa adjacent schools. So the areas around Ottawa, you need to have been graduated from these schools, and you'll have a preferential admission into their school because around 50% of their seats are reserved for individuals who have graduated from an Ottawa, from a school that is close to Ottawa or Ottawa itself. But you can apply in your third year. They do have prerequisites, so you need to take 2 classes in humanities and social sciences, 2 classes in biology, 1 class in chemistry, 1 class in organic chemistry, and 1 class in physics. And all of these need to come with labs. You need to do a lab component with it. The MCAT is not required because there's no French MCAT. If a school offers their education in French, they can't be requesting MCAT. But the CASPER is required in the language of the program you're applying to. So if you're applying to the English program, you need to do your CASPER in English. If you're applying to the French program, you need to do the CASPER in French if you're applying for the French program. And again, they do look into your extracurriculars and heavily favor them. The minimum GPA to apply is 3.5, and it's usually cumulative. So they look at all 4 years, and then they take the average of that, and that would be your GPA. The next one is the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. That is usually in the Lakehead area. So it's a 4-year program. There's around 88 spots offered. They have campuses in both Sudbury and Thunder Bay, which is pretty far away from Mississauga and the GTA area. You need to do 4 years of university, so you cannot apply in your third year, versus the other schools like McMaster, Queen's, Western, Toronto, where you can apply in your third year. For this one, you need to finish your undergraduate degree or be in your 4th year when you are applying. There are no prerequisites, so you don't need to complete any specific classes in order to be accepted. There's no MCAT or CASPER required, but they do look into your extracurriculars. The minimum GPA to apply is 3.0, and you get a 0.2 bonus if you've done a graduate degree, so a master's or a PhD. And you do know, because they require no MCAT or CASPER, the thing is this school heavily favors people who are from a northern or rural background, if they're indigenous or francophone, so speak French as their first language, or have previous work experience in the North. And usually these criteria make it impossible for students like me, for example, to apply to their school, because it would be very difficult for me to show that I have previous experience or I'm from the North or I have a rural background. So just something to keep in mind. You're welcome to apply to the school if you want, but usually most people opt not to apply to the school because they just do not have the connectedness to the northern or rural areas that they're looking for. Good news, however, is that the Toronto Metropolitan University just announced their medical school, or starting to enroll for their medical school. So it's a 4-year program. The campus will be in Brampton, so it won't be in downtown Toronto. It's a campus located in Brampton. The first cohort, so the first class, will be in September 2025. So the first class will start in September 2025. That means that our applicants will apply to their school in October 2024. So in the next couple of months, you'll be able to apply to the TMU Medical School in Brampton. There'll be around 94 spots offered. There is no Ontario bias. That should not say special streams for Southwestern Ontario students, pardon me. And they do mention that they utilize a holistic approach to admission. And what they mean by that is there's no mention if there's any prerequisites, and they do not mention if CASPER is required, but the MCAT will not be required for this school. So you don't need to do the MCAT in order to apply for the school, because they're looking at a more holistic approach. And what holistic means is that they're looking at the overall person, what their circumstances were, what their GPA is. They look at the person overall. They're just not looking at the hardline numbers versus other schools which require you to do well in academics or do well in extracurriculars. Again, they have not mentioned if there's a minimum GPA, but they do mention that they will be looking into extracurriculars, right? They mention that they heavily favor individuals who want to pursue a career in primary care. So if you're, again, a person who wants to do family medicine, you know for a fact that you want to do family medicine, TMU mentions that they favor individuals who are looking to do family medicine. But there are rumors that say that they will have appeal, so Mississauga, Brampton bias, but that is a rumor. And there's rumors that say that they have a GPA cutoff of 3.3. So GPA is not even going to be used competitively. It will just be a cutoff. So as long as you are 3.3 or above, you're good to go. But again, this is unconfirmed, and they still have not released any official information on that. Coming soon, however, is another medical school at York University. So York is also looking to open their own medical school, but that has not opened yet. The campus will be in North York in Vaughan. That program is going to be a 3-year accelerated program, so that would make it the third program in Canada that is 3 years. It's primary care focused. So again, if you're looking to be a family physician, this could be your program. And they're looking to start their first day of school in September 2028. So it's still a long way ahead. They've just announced that they've received some funding, but that is something to look forward to if you're in grade 12 or if you just started university. By the time you graduate, this could be a viable option for you to apply to. They mentioned that there's going to be around 240 spots offered. So after 4 years, they hope to have around 240 spots. But there's no mention on academic requirements or non-academic requirements yet. So we still don't know much about this school. So one thing to note, so in terms of Ontario schools, this is all of it. So we mentioned there's Queen's, McMaster, Toronto, U of T, Western Ontario, Northern Ontario School of Medicine, TMU, which is going to open soon, and York. One thing to note after that is the rest of Canada, or the rest of the schools in Canada, in-province bias will start playing a bigger role in admission. So what that means is that if you're a person who has lived in Saskatchewan, or you've lived in Alberta, or you've lived in BC for your whole life, the requirements for you to be admitted into medical school will be much lower than those that are applying out of province. So if you are a Ontario student looking to apply to University of Saskatchewan's medical school, the requirements for you to get in will be much higher than those of a person who's lived in Saskatchewan for their whole life and is looking to get into medical school. And the percentage of seats reserved for the in-province students will be much higher. So usually 80 to 90% or even more than that of these seats offered will be for those individuals who have lived in these provinces. And one thing to keep in mind is I'm going to start using IP, so in province, and OOP, so out of province. So just if you've seen that on the slides, you know what that means. So let's start by talking about Western Canada medical schools. We'll start with the closest to Ontario and move out west. So starting with the University of Manitoba, it's a 4-year program. The campus is in Winnipeg. There's around 125 spots offered annually, but 95% of these seats are reserved for Manitoba residents. And to be a Manitoba resident, you need to have either graduated high school in Manitoba, received a degree from a Manitoba university, so you went to University of Manitoba and got a degree, or you're in the process of getting a degree from a university in Manitoba, or you've resided in Manitoba for 2 years after high school graduation. So that does not include the time where you're in university. So you graduated high school, you've lived for 2 years, then you went to university, or you graduated university and then you've lived in Manitoba for 2 years. So you need to have lived for 2 years. And it also has a special bilingual stream. So if you're able to speak fluent French or you've attended a French high school, they have a special stream for you that you can apply to in Manitoba. You must also complete an Indigenous course before admission. So if they do admit you, you need to complete an Indigenous course, or you need to have finished an Indigenous course. That varies from university to university. So you need to look at what university you're attending or planning to attend and whether they offer an Indigenous course the University of Manitoba accepts. They do require CASPER, but it is used not competitively. So it is not used to compare students. You just need to do it. And the minimum GPA is 3.3 out of a 4.50. So they use a different scale than Ontario schools or the rest of Canada. So you need a minimum of 3.3. But the minimum to get, or they're usually the median, so the middle score to get an invite is 4.5 out of 4.5 for individuals who are not from Manitoba. And this is something you're going to see for the rest of the schools that I'm going to be talking about. The requirements for those who are out of province are very, very, very high, versus 4.25 for the in-province students. The median MCAT for IP is 513. So usually that means 87 percentile. So you did better than 87% of people. And for out of province is 522. So 99th percentile. So you essentially need to be the very best of the best in order to apply to University of Manitoba. The good thing, however, about the U of M is that it does not look into extracurriculars. So if you're a person who's very good in academics, if you're able to get a 522 plus, if you have a 4.5 out of 4.5 or close to a 4.5 out of 4.5, you can have a decent shot of getting if you're getting accepted into the University of Manitoba. So just something to keep in mind. Talking about the University of Saskatchewan, my alma mater, it's a 4-year program. They have campuses in Saskatoon and Regina. There's around 105 spots offered annually, but 95% of these seats are reserved for Saskatchewan residents. And it used to be the most popular spots for Ontario students to go to because of their in-province bias. But the past 2 years, they changed that system into a Saskatchewan Connectedness Index. And what the Saskatchewan Connectedness Index is, it's essentially 7 questions that ask about your Saskatchewan overall connectedness. So it essentially asks whether you've lived in Saskatchewan for the past 3 years, or if you've lived in Saskatchewan for the past 15 years, if you've graduated from a high school in Saskatchewan, or you went to a school that is at least 100 kilometers or 300 kilometers away from an urban center. So if you're a rural applicant. But from what I have gathered and from what a lot of my friends have gathered is that essentially you must either have an extremely high MCAT and have lived in Saskatchewan for 3 years, or have a decent MCAT but have lived in Saskatchewan for the past 15 years in order to be accepted into the U of S. Gone are the days where you can just stay in Saskatchewan for 3 years and be accepted as an in-province student. They have taken that option away. So just something to keep in mind. But it also has a specific substream for individuals who have faced socioeconomic challenges. So if you're a refugee, if you have a big family, if your family's income is very low, if you face challenges, then they have a stream that makes it easier for people who have faced these challenges to get accepted. Again, you also must complete an Indigenous course before being admitted. It requires CASPER, though not competitively. And the minimum, and they use percentages in Saskatchewan. So the minimum percentage is 80%. So you need to have a minimum average of 80%. But the median for the accepted individuals is usually around 87.8. And they do add an extra 2% if you just started a graduate program. So if you're in the first year of master's or you're about to complete your master's, it's 2%. If you finish a program, it's 3%. And if you're in a PhD program, if you finished it, they add an extra 4% to your average as a bonus. The minimum MCAT is 492, with 122 allowed in one section, but usually the median accepted is 507. And you must complete 2 personal statements as well. So they do not look into your extracurriculars, but they ask you to expand on it on the personal statements that they ask. The University of Alberta, for your program, is located in Edmonton, Alberta, and you can apply to the U of A in your 3rd year. So that makes it around 5 schools so far, or 6 schools that we've talked about, then you can apply in your 3rd year. There's around 100 spots offered annually, but again, 85% of these seats are reserved for in-province students. So to be considered an Alberta resident, you need to have lived in Alberta for 1 year prior to the first day of classes. So what that means is if classes start in September 2025, in September 2024, you need to have been living in Alberta. So that gives you the whole year to be considered as an Alberta resident, right? You don't need to have lived in Alberta for 1 year before the application. No, you need to have lived in Alberta for 1 year before the first day of class starts. And if you're presenting with 4+ years of full-time study, so you've essentially finished your bachelor's degree, they will remove the lowest year from your GPA calculation. So the minimum GPA from the in-province students is 3.3, but the average accepted is 3.8. And for out-of-province, the minimum is 3.5, but the average accepted is 3.85. And if you're a graduate student, you can receive extra points. CASPER is required, but is used non-competitively. And the MCAT is required. You need a minimum of 124 in all sections if you're an in-province student. But if you're an out-of-province student, you need a minimum of 128 in CARS and minimum of 124 in all other sections to be considered. But it is no longer used competitively. So they no longer compare you based on your CARS score. You just need to get a minimum of 128. They do look at your extracurriculars, and they do ask you to write personal statements. So there's 3 essay questions that you need to answer. Next up is the University of Calgary. The University of Calgary is the other program that is 3 years. The campus is in Calgary. You can apply in your 3rd year as well. So that's another school you can apply to in your 3rd year. There's around 175 spots offered, but again, 85% of these seats are reserved for in-province students. And you must have resided in Alberta for the past 2 years to be before the first day of classes to be considered an IP for the U of C. Versus U of A, where you need to be there for 1 year, U of C asks you to be in Alberta for 2 years before the first day of classes. And they use cumulative GPA. So cumulative means they take a look at all years of your university degree. And the IP minimum is 3.2, but usually the average is 3.9. So that's very, very high even for IP students. And for out of province, the minimum is 3.8, but the average accepted is 3.95. In terms of CASPER, CASPER is not required for the UFC, and MCAT is required, however. There's no minimum score for in-province students, so if you lived in Calgary for 2 years, you don't need to get a minimum score in the MCAT. But if you're an out-of-province student, you need to get a minimum of 128 in CARS, and it is used competitively. So the higher your score in CARS, the better you will do. And usually the average accepted is 129.23 for CARS. They look into your extracurriculars, but instead of asking you to just list all of them, they ask you to pick your top 10 and expand more on them. Versus Ontario schools, for example, which just asks you to list all your personal activities. And again, you must take an Indigenous course if you're accepted. Finally, the last school in Western Canada is UBC, the University of British Columbia. It's a 4-year program. Again, you can apply in your 3rd year. They have campuses in Vancouver, in Victoria, in Kelowna, and Prince George, and you would rank your campuses. There's around 330 spots offered annually, but 90% of these seats are reserved for BC residents. So to be considered a BC resident, you need to possess a BC service card. So unlike other schools like the U of A, USAS, they usually assume that you're telling the truth, but sometimes they do occasionally ask for proof that you are a resident of that province. BC, however, asks for the BC service card. So you need to provide them physical proof that you are a BC resident. And to get the BC services card, you need to have lived in BC for the past 6 months and sign up with the government. And you must complete an equivalent of 2 university English classes. And you need to check your course eligibility. So they do not accept all English classes. You need to make sure that the English classes you take are accepted by UBC. The good thing is, though, they do not require CASPER. The minimum percent GPA is 75 if you're an in-province student, and the minimum for out-of-province student is 85%. But usually the accepted average is 89.63. So it's still pretty high. And the MCAT is used competitively after the interview. So they do not look at your MCAT scores before the interview. If you are given an interview to UBC, it is only then that they would look at your MCAT scores. And usually the average accepted score is 514, which is pretty high. That is in the 87th percentile. The minimum score is 124 in all sections. And the good thing about UBC is they look at your best MCAT exam score. So let's say you've done the MCAT 3 times. The first time you got 490, second time you got 514, and the third time you got 505. Usually most schools will look at your last score, but for UBC, they will look at your best score. And they do look into your extracurricular. One thing to know with UBC is that they heavily frown upon shadowing activities. So they view it as a red flag. So if you tell them that you have shadowed a doctor as an undergraduate or as a high school student, that would be a red flag on your application. So there's something to keep in mind is that not all schools like it when you participate in a setting where you have access to private or confidential information. So just one thing to keep in mind. Okay, shifting to talk about the maritime medical schools, sorry. There's not a lot of them, and we're going to be looking at schools now that are getting more and more restrictive, so even harder for you to get accepted as a student who's not from these provinces. So the first one is Dalhousie University. It's a 4-year program. They have campuses in Halifax, Cape Breton, and St. John. Not to be confused, St. John in New Brunswick, not to be confused with St. John in Newfoundland. But there's 2 St. Johns, which I did not know. You can apply in your 3rd year. There's around 134 spots offered annually, but 93.3% of these seats are offered for maritime residents. So you need to have lived in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, or in Prince Edward Island for at least 12 months before the application deadline. So if the application deadline is in November 2024, you need to have lived in one of these 3 provinces for at least 12 months before the application deadline. So from November 2023, you should have been living in one of these 3 provinces in order to be considered a maritime resident. And each province has different quotas. So if you're from Nova Scotia, 116 of the 134 seats are reserved for you. If you're from New Brunswick, 40 of these seats are offered for you. And if you're from PEI, 6 of these seats are reserved for a PEI resident. And they only offer 6 seats for non-maritime residents. So anyone from the rest of Canada can apply, but there's only 6 seats, and there's almost 1,000 applicants fighting for these 6 seats. They do require CASPER, and it is used competitively. At least that's what they mentioned on their website. The minimum GPA is 3.3 for out of province and 3.3 if you're in province. My bad for the mistake. And 3.7 for out of province. But usually the average accepted is 3.9. And they look at the last 3 years. So if you did 4 years of university, they only look at the last 3 years. Or you've done 5 years, they only look at the last 3. The minimum MCAT depends on your applicant's GPA. You need to get a minimum of 123, but let's say you have a high GPA. So you have a GPA of 3.7. The minimum MCAT you need as an in-province student is 495. But if you have a GPA of 3.7 and you're an out-of-province student, the minimum MCAT is 503. They do look into your extracurriculars, and they do ask you for why you want to attend Dalhousie. Speaking more about Memorial University, so Memorial is located in Newfoundland, sorry. They have campuses in Halifax, Cape Breton, and St. John. So this St. John is different than the other St. John we were talking about. There's around 85 spots offered annually, but 84% of them are reserved for 92.5% of them are reserved for maritime residents. So you must have the way they define it is that you must have significant roots in Newfoundland or Labrador in order to be considered a resident. What that essentially means is that you need to have 4 years either of middle school or high school experience in Newfoundland, or you must have lived in Newfoundland for the past 3 consecutive years. You do have lived in Newfoundland for the past 3 consecutive years, not including academic studies. There's up to 6 seats offered for non-maritime residents. They do require CASPER, and it is used competitively. Just give me a second. So the minimum GPA to apply there's no minimum GPA to apply, but the average accepted is 3.80. Just something to keep in mind. No minimum MCAT, but the average accepted is 500. And they do look into your extracurriculars, but they do mention that it is a holistic approach. The University of Prince Edward Island is a university that is still in progress. It is a 4-year program. The campus is in Charlottetown, PI, but for right now, it's still a partnership with the Memorial University, so there's the same admission policies, and it's still not fully independent and developed yet. One thing to keep in mind is, again, for the University of Prince Edward Island, it is going to be most likely more PEI resident focused compared to open for everyone involved, everyone in Canada. So finally, talking about the Quebec medical schools, and these are probably the most restrictive schools out there because they only offer admission if you are a Quebec resident, pretty much. So starting off with McGill University, which is probably the most lenient one compared to the rest of them. It's a 4-year program. They have a campus in Montreal and in Gatineau, Quebec. There's around 134 spots offered annually, and they do accept international students. But 93% of these seats are reserved for Quebec residents. And to be considered a Quebec resident, there are many streams, but there's like 11 of them. But the most relevant ones are either you're born in Quebec, you did high school in Quebec, and you're attending McGill. You resided in Quebec for 1 year before application deadline. So you need to have a health card that you show them, and you need to be in Quebec before the application deadline. And there's usually up to 11 seats offered for non-Quebec residents. So if you're not able to get a Quebec residency, there's up to 11 seats out of the 134. They do require CASPER in French or in English, so they do allow you that option. And it is used competitively. So around 20% of your pre-interview criteria is based on your CASPER score. And you must complete a French language proficiency exam. And this is a new requirement that they have. You need to show proficiency in the French language in order to be accepted into McGill University. They do have prerequisites, so you need to do 2 bio classes, 2 chemistry classes, 2 physics classes, usually it's 1, and 1 organic chemistry classes. The minimum GPA for out-of-province students is 3.5. For in-province, again, my mistake for it saying out of province, and 3.80 for out of province. Usually the average accepted is 3.88 if you're an in-province student, and 3.95 if you're an out of province student. So again, very high GPA requirements. And it is 70% of your pre-interview criteria as well. So it is very GPA favored. The MCAT is not required because, again, it's a French school. And they do look into your extracurriculars, but they ask it in a CV format, so in a curriculum vitae format, and that accounts for 10% of your pre-interview criteria. Next up is Université Laval. It's a 4-year program. They have campuses in Quebec City, in Lévis, and Rimouski. You can apply in your second year, actually. The way Quebec medical schools work is that you can actually apply as a second-year student in university. You can go to their college, a college in Quebec, and then apply after. They have a very, very different system than the rest of Canada, but it is very, very restrictive to non-Quebec residents. They have around 300 spots that they offer annually, but almost all of these seats are reserved for Quebec residents. The way, again, they consider themselves to be considered Quebec resident is similar to how McGill defines it. They require CASPER, but you need to write it in French. So now most of these schools are now going to require CASPER in French. Again, no MCAT is required, and you must complete a French language proficiency exam. They're not clear about their GPA requirements because Quebec schools use a different way of calculating one's academic performance, and that is not really well known to the public. So that's Université Laval. Next up, it's the University of Montreal. Again, sorry for the mistakes. It's a 4-year program. They have campuses in Montreal and in Trois-Rivières. There's around 300 spots offered annually, and they do accept international students. But 96.4% of these seats are reserved for Quebec residents. Again, similar, they define Quebec residents similar to how McGill defines it, but they do offer up to 11 seats for non-Quebec residents. Again, they require CASPER in French. You must complete a French language proficiency exam. They do have prerequisites, so 2 bio, 2 chemistry, 2 physics, and 1 organic chemistry. The MCAT is not required for the Université de Montréal. Finally, there's the Université de Sherbrooke. It's a 4-year program. There's campuses in Sherbrooke, Chicoutimi, and Moncton. There's around 287 spots offered annually, and they do accept international students. But again, 96% of these seats are reserved for Quebec residents. Similar, they define us as a Quebec resident similar to how McGill defines them a Quebec resident, and there's 11 seats for non-Quebec residents. You need to write CASPER in French. You must complete a French proficiency exam. They have the same prerequisites. No MCAT is required. So these two universities, Université de Montréal and Sherbrooke, are similar in terms of the requirements, but they're very, very restrictive when it comes to being a student that is coming from Ontario or Saskatchewan, or from a province that does not have French as their main speaking language. Okay, so that is it in terms of the Canadian medical schools, or a deep dive into Canadian medical schools. Next up, I'm just going to be briefly talking about extracurriculars, because that can make up a great percentage of your application. It can either make or break an application. The one thing to note is that when it comes to extracurriculars, they're not always necessary. So as we discussed, some schools like McMaster do not factor in extracurriculars when deciding who gets an interview. Others like U of T or U of C or U of A factor them heavily. Extracurriculars, so ACs, however, are still important because they provide you with the experiences or the life lessons or the things that or the networking abilities that you can then use in your interviews, or when talking about in your interviews. You can use these experiences to talk about the things you've learned, the communication skills you've learned, the leadership skills you've learned. You use that in your interviews, use these experiences in your extracurriculars in your interviews, and that can help showcase what a great applicant you are. But the question now is, what activities should you engage in? The usual answer is whatever you want. Whatever you can think of, that could count as an extracurricular, but there are activities that are better than others. And to judge what activity is better, what activity counts as a good activity, what activity counts as a bad activity per se, you use something called the CAN-MEDS framework. And the CAN-MEDS framework is, as they define it, a competency framework that identifies and describes the abilities physicians require to effectively meet the healthcare needs of the people they serve. So essentially, the physicians of Canada sat down together, and they decided that these 6 competencies is what they are looking for future physicians, and that are professional, communicator, scholar, health advocate, leader, and a collaborator. And so when you have an activity, or when you're about to engage in an extracurricular, or when you're looking to engage in an extracurricular, look to see if you can relate that activity to one of these 6 competencies. And the more competencies you're able to relate that activity to, the better that activity is. So for example, and I'm gonna talk about research next. Research would apply very well into scholar, into being a leader, into being a communicator, into being a collaborator. And so the more competencies an activity is able to hit on, the better of an activity it is. So briefly talking about some common activities that pre-med students engage in, the first one is research. So it's arguably the most important activity to have, if possible. It is essentially an unspoken requirement for admission to medical school. So schools will not ask you specifically to engage in research or to have research experience, but because more and more of applicants are having that research experience, if you do not have it, you are missing out. Not only you're missing out on it, but your application will not be viewed as favorably as the rest of the applicants. But you can get engaged in research as early as in your first or second year, in the summers, or even in postgrad. So after you graduate, you can still be engaged in research. It allows for cool experiences through presentation, conferences, symposiums, research symposiums. You're able to work on your public speaking skills, but also gain valuable experience, network with other individuals from all over Canada, and get to attend cool conferences and learn about new advances in science. So how can you get involved? The easiest way and the way that requires a lot of work, unfortunately, is emailing professors and researchers. So they do not have to be in the same program or even in the same university. One example of that is in my first year of university, actually, I was in a chemistry class and I was really interested in what my chemistry professor was teaching. And even though I'm a kinesiology student, I went up to that professor and I asked them and I told them that I was very interested in the research that they were doing and if it is possible for me to be part of their lab and get their research experience working in a chemistry lab as a kinesiology student. And they accepted, and I was about to start working with them, but then COVID hit. But this just goes to show that it does not have to be in the same program or even in the same university. You can search for opportunities online. So one opportunity to look for is the NSERC USRAs, which are summer research programs specifically made for undergraduate students. That does require a bit more work, and I can talk with individuals on private later on if you're interested in that. But again, be proactive, show interest, and be open to learning. Most professors know that as a first year or as a second year student, you may not know all that is in that specific field. They're not asking for you to be an expert in that field. What they are asking for you, though, is to show enthusiasm, to show that you want to learn, to show that you want to be involved, that you're proactive, that you're showing initiative, that you're taking the time on your own to be familiar with the protocols and then come up to the lab, show up to the lab, willing to learn and willing to put in that effort. So if you show that, trust me, that goes further than being an expert in a certain field. And if your university offers an honors program, enroll in that. Usually honor programs are offered in your fourth year, and they're essentially, instead of taking 3 classes or 4 classes, instead of taking these classes, you take them as a research class. And what that means is from the first day of class, you work on developing your own research project. You come up with the question, you come up with the protocol, you collect the data, you analyze the data, then you present the data. So it's essentially a small master's research project shrunk down into 1 year worth of experience. So if you're able to provide that, and if your school offers that, it can be a great way for you to engage in research. And this is actually, I got to experience my first conference in Calgary this past September. So this was a research project that I've been working on for the past 3 years. I was able to come up with a poster, collected the data, and then I presented the data to researchers from all over Canada. Researchers from all over Canada and all over the world came to this research conference, and I presented the data that I collected and analyzed. So universities love it when you show that you engage in conferences or you've presented in conferences. So just something to keep in mind. The next thing that a lot of people engage in is university clubs, and it's probably the most common extracurricular in any application or for any applicant. And they usually showcase the person's interest, and they could be a good networking experience. They're not inherently bad, and they're always good to have, but unfortunately, and usually the biggest gripe when it comes to university clubs is that they're a waste of time. And that's why if you were to engage in a university club, you want to make sure that it has some substance to it, because they often lack substance. They're very superficial in nature. They have limited capabilities because a university club can only do so much. And then it's especially obvious if you're just a member. So in your application, if you just mention that you are a member of this club, it doesn't really show to the universities, okay, this person has shown collaboration skills or this person has shown leadership skills. And that's why it doesn't make it a very good extracurricular to have, but it can be transformed to a great extracurricular by either founding a club, for example, but not just founding any club. If that club needs to do things in the community and address the needs of the community. And I'll show you an example of that. And it needs to be part of the executive committee. Sorry, you need to be part, you can either be part of the executive committee, and that could be another way for you to elevate that university club experience. So that can either be in a leadership position, more power to engage, and that gives you more power to engage and get things done in the community versus you just being a member and attending once a week and not really doing much. If you're part of the executive community, that could showcase better how much of an influence you're able to have. But no, most medical schools do not care about your high school clubs. I'm sorry. If you're in high school and you are in the math club, for example, unfortunately, and I hate to say it, but most medical schools do not care about that. It's good to mention it. You can mention it, but it will not play a big factor. It will not decide whether you get accepted or not. It could always be a positive, but it can never hurt. But they just do not care much about your high school clubs. And some of them do not even really care about your university clubs either, if it does not have any substance. One good example is the Emma Humanitarian Club, which is a university club that was founded in my university. And this is an example of a club that is not just a meet and greet club. It's not a club that just convenes once a week. The members share a couple stories and they go about their day. It was a club that actually benefited the community. And one way they did that is they provided winter packages to homeless individuals every year. They had culture nights where they invited individuals from different cultures to showcase different cultures. They had a dental hygiene awareness events. They were very heavily involved in their community, and that what can make or break a club is what are you doing to your community? If it's just a club where you go and hang out with each other, it will not have as much of an impact on your application as a person who's talking about a club that they founded that had a significant impact that they can quantify on their application. For example, being in the AML Club, I was objectively able to say that with the AML Club, we were able to help around 200, for example, 200 homeless individuals, provided them with aid packages in the winter that helped at least ease their struggles in the winter. Oh, we were able to hit 15 schools. Each school had around 200 students where we informed them about good dental hygiene practices. So it is all about what you do with the club. And the more you're able to do with the club, the better that will be on your application. Next thing you can talk about is hobbies. And that is something that is not really talked about much when it comes to your applications. And fun fact is that you can actually include your hobbies when talking about your extracurriculars on your applications, especially if they're hobbies that you have been engaging in for a long periods of time. So things like cooking, photography, drawing, musical instruments, sewing, traveling, etc. These are all hobbies that you can talk about on your application because not only they can show long-term commitment, but they can also show to the medical schools that you're not a robot. You're an actual person who has their own hobbies, who likes to engage in things in their community or with themselves, or likes to engage in things that make them happy. One thing I want to do note that is, and it's a very heavily contested topic, is video games. I know some people like to put video games on their application, but it is a double-edged sword. So just be aware of that. Not all schools are happy when you put video games because of the stigma it has, that it's a time waster. But if you were in some capacity engaged in organizing video game nights with your friends or organizing community video game competitions, or you're involved in a professional capacity in video games, that could be potentially an avenue to explore. But usually video games is not something you want to talk about in your interviews. So just something to keep in mind. It's even better, like I mentioned, if you've won any awards, if you're engaged in competitions, and that could be a good way to talk about clubs. Clubs that relate to hobbies are good clubs because they mention that you can network and collaborate with other individuals. It's always good to have some physical proof of the activity if possible. For example, the U of A specifically asks if you have any URLs or any links that could take you and show them proof of that activity. So, for example, I'm very involved in cooking. I love cooking. So I have an Instagram page where I showcase the food that I make or the food that I cook. And if you want to go follow that, My Diamond Kitchen on Instagram, I appreciate the follows. Maybe you know how to do that. Finally, work experience. Almost all universities will ask you for your employment history. So they will ask you what jobs you had for the past 4, 5, or 6 years. There's the one thing I want to know is that there's no shame in work, and there's no shame if the only experience you have is work experience. Not everyone has the ability to take the time out of their day to engage in clubs or engage in any of the activities we described above. And a lot of individuals, the only experience they have is work experience. And that experience could be beneficial in and of itself, especially if it's an experience where you can showcase that you've been promoted. So you started off as a cashier, you worked your way up to an assistant manager, and now you're a manager. Like that showcases to the university that you're a person who is showcasing the abilities to be promoted, showing leadership abilities, showing professionalism, etc. So there's one thing to keep in mind. And just to quickly talk about unique experiences, you always want to be on the lookout for these unique experiences because they can help set you apart from everyone else. If everyone has research, if everyone has club experiences, if everyone has some hobbies that they're talking about, how will you as an applicant be different than the rest of the applicants out there? This is your way to shine, is through these unique experiences. And they can be in any field and in any form. So for example, when I was in USask, our kinesiology program offered something called the Student Trainer Program. And it was essentially a program where it gave me hands-on experience with sports medicine. So I collaborated and I worked with university sports team for a whole year. And not many schools offered that experience. So that is me on the top there in our uh, team photo. So I spent a whole year working as essentially a medic for that sports team for the whole year. And not many schools offered that opportunity. And I believe this was a very unique opportunity that I had. It changed my complete outlook. I got introduced to many different people in many different fields that I'm still very close friends with. But if no such experiences exist, create them. And if you can't create them, then that is also fine. You can do just well without these unique experiences. You can still get into medical school. So quickly talking about applications and interviews. And one thing to note is that applications are open already. So if you haven't started them and you're looking to apply, you should probably start. Again, remember, Canada does not have a centralized system unlike the US, and each school has a separate deadline. For example, Memorial University's deadline is August 28th. Dalhousie is September 3rd. UBC is September 13th. For Ontario, U of A, U of C, U of M, USask is all October 1st, albeit at a different time. So Ontario is at 4:30. So again, also keep in mind what time is the application due. Ontario is 4:30. U of A and USask was at 11:59, if I remember correctly, but double check. And Quebec schools is usually November 1st. You also want to, again, keep in mind the MCAT deadlines, CASPER deadlines, and your references deadlines. And keep in mind that these applications cost money. They're not free. And they can range anywhere from $95 to $255 per school. One tip is that OMSAS, so the Ontario Medical School Application Service, does offer a fee waiver program. So if you are able to provide them proof that your family's income is low or you're not able to pay for that, they do offer you a fee waiver program, but you need to apply for that early and you need to check the website when is the application deadline. And some schools like USask, for example, also offer a fee waiver program as well. So if you're not able to pay for the fee for the application, they can waive that for you if you provide the supporting documents. One thing to also keep in mind is that applications are not saved year to year. So always save your applications after submitting them. You can use that for future years if you're looking to apply again in the future by referencing the dates, which verifiers did you use, what did you do wrong in the last year, and what can you improve upon on the next year. So always save your applications after you submit them. You can like go and print the web page and save it as a PDF. So some tips. Medical schools, especially the non-Ontario ones, often list on their website the qualities that they're looking for in their future students. So remember, we talked about the CANMED rules, but often universities uh, have specifically the things that they're looking for in their future medical students. And so what you want to do is try to write your experiences with these qualities in mind. For example, UFT mentions that they're looking for 4 clusters specifically: professional, communicator, collaborator, manager, advocate, and scholar. And they give you specifically the key words that they're looking for: maturity, reliability, perseverance. And so if you're able to mention these activities in your extracurriculars, you'll be able to set yourself apart from other individuals, but also showcase that the values that you have are well aligned with the school that you're applying to. And also keep in mind that you will need to provide verifier hours and dates for every activity that you mention. So make sure that you record all of that and make sure that you're contacting the verifiers early on. You do not want to be like me in one of the years where one verifier for an activity that I had just would not reply to me until the very, very last second. Like that verifier replied at 2:30 when my application was due at 4:30, and you don't want to spare yourself that headache. Okay. And you can also use that verifier as a reference for your application. And what I mean by references is that most schools will ask for references who can speak on your personality and character. Some schools will ask for 2. So, for example, the U of A will only ask you for 2 references. Some will ask you for 3, like the Ontario schools. Some schools will specifically ask for at least 1 academic reference. So that can either be a teacher or a research supervisor, and a non-academic reference. So your employer or your supervisor, another example. And so it's a good idea to stay in touch with your professors that you like, that you had a good relationship with when you were taking their classes, even if you finished their classes a while ago. Like for example, in my first year of university, I stayed in touch with a professor that I really enjoyed being in her class with. Every time I would pass, I would say hi, I would ask her about her day, just to keep that friendliness going on. And when it was time for me to apply, I asked that person if it would be possible for me, if it would be possible for them to be my reference. And they were able to provide me with a very solid reference letter for the universities that I applied to. Some schools will ask them to fill out a form, some will ask them to write out answers, and some will just call them. So again, contact your references early and have them aware of what the expectations are. And again, thank for their time. You do not want to blindside your references or your potential references and tell them that last second, hey, can you write me a reference letter or can you fill out this form? They will forget, they're very busy, and that's why it's important for you to contact them early. And only choose references who you will be able to speak well about you. If you believe that this person might potentially not speak well or even might speak badly about you, then do not ask them for a reference. This person will do way more harm than they can ever do good for you and could potentially make or break your application. So just be very wary about who you're choosing to be your reference. Okay. In terms of interviews, they're often conducted from January to March of the cycle year. So for this year, it would be in 2025. There's 2 types of interview for medical schools in Canada. There's the multiple mini interviews, which are created by McMaster. They're a series of 6 to 10 stations, usually 10 minutes each, where you're asked a question. You have 2 minutes to think of an answer and 8 minutes to answer. They're now virtual and can be synchronous or asynchronous. So you can either be talking to an actual person or you can just be recording a video response that then gets uploaded and gets viewed later on. The time where you showcase this is the time where you can showcase your activities, your personality, and your experiences. The other time is through panel interviews, and they're usually about an hour. There's 2 to 3 individuals who ask you a series of questions, and they're usually more personal and focus more on you versus ethical scenarios. So in the MMIs, you can be provided with a scenario. You can be asked to role play as a physician, as a teacher, blah, blah, blah. Versus in a panel interview, you're asked specifically questions about you. What makes you a good leader? Can you provide us with a time where you went through this specific life lesson, etc.? So that's it in terms of applications and interviews. I want to quickly talk about international and US medical schools because I know it's an option that a lot of people like to consider. In terms of US medical schools, there's over 190 medical schools in the US, but not all of them accept Canadian students. So you need to do your own research on what schools will accept international and Canadian students. Some schools classify everyone out of the US as international. Some schools have 3 categories: US schools, or US students, Canadian students, and international students. So you have a different stream as a Canadian. So just do your own research, but some schools to keep in mind are Emory, Michigan, St. Louis, UCLA, and then you have the Ivy Leagues like Harvard, Stanford, etc. But that's only if you have very high stats. And there's also Albert Einstein. These are some potential schools that you can look into. Um, Almost all of them have prerequisites in science, so 2 bios, 2 chems, 2 physics. And specifically for US medical schools, they usually ask for 2 organic chemistries, not 1, like in Canada. Almost all of them require MCAT, CASPER, and some even require a separate test called the preview, which is similar to CASPER. Almost all of them require 3 to 7 references. So, and a lot of them have to be academic or science references. So from a science professor that has taught you. So there's something to keep in mind. The more relationships you're able to have with your professors, the better. And unlike Canada, the admissions are on a rolling basis, so versus the deadline. So applications open on May 1st, and you need to submit your primary application, which is your basic information, by late July to early August. The later you are, the less chances you have of getting accepted into medical school in the US. So you need to get on it early. Secondaries are usually should be submitted as soon as possible. So secondaries is usually like your personal statements, your university or specific US medical school specific questions. You need to submit those as early as possible, or else you could risk not getting accepted. And you can even get accepted into US medical schools by January if you really like if you finish everything early on. One thing to note is that they're very expensive, and they can range anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 a year, US dollars a year, and you may or may not be able to get OSAP if you're an Ontario resident. I know, for example, Michigan State University costs $200,000 US per year. I do not have that kind of money. If you have that kind of money, then and you want to pursue that, then that is something to keep in mind. But what I do ask from you is to keep in mind is whether you want to do an MD school or a DO school. So MD is the regular medical degree. DO, or the Doctor of Osteopathy, it's extremely similar to MD schools, but they are more holistic. And what I mean by that is they're usually more life experience favored versus academics like the MD schools. So in MD schools, they look at your GPA, your MCAT, your CASPER, like very specific objective points. But for DOs, they usually are more life experience focused, and they're more primary care focused, but you can specialize in fields similar to MD schools. They also generally have lower admission requirements than MD schools. And as a Canadian or an international applicant, you typically need 510 on your MCAT and very high GPA to be accepted into an MD school. DO schools are usually a bit lower than that. There are no DO schools in Canada, but it is recognized, and you can practice in Canada with proper accreditation. So you need to do your MCCQs. I'm not too familiar in specific subfields, so you would need to do your own research in terms of where you can work, what you can do as a DO trained doctor. In terms of international schools, so specifically schools like Ireland, Qatar, Australia, etc., they're a very solid, viable option. They're similar to the US in terms of requirements and costs, and they're very similar in terms of how they're viewed as applicants in residency in Canada's eyes. So previously, if you were a US applicant, there used to be an agreement between US and Canada where they did not consider each other's medical students as international students. So a Canadian student was able to apply to US schools as most of the time as a US resident or as a US applicant, and vice versa. US applicants were able to apply to Canadian residencies as Canadian residents, but that recently changed, and now both sides view each other as international medical graduates. What that means for you is that if you go to Ireland, if you go to the US, if you go to Qatar, if you go to Australia, if you plan on coming back to Canada, you will be viewed as an international medical graduate. So you're all the same pretty much. And they're all similar in terms of requirements and costs. So MCAT, CASPER, etc. The downsides is that for specifically Ireland, Qatar, Australia, is that they're often 5 to 6 years, not 4, unlike the MD schools in the US. They're easier to get into compared to US schools, so that's one potential benefit. And the most common ones is RCSI, so the Royal College of Surgeons Ireland. They both have a campus in Ireland and in Bahrain. But if you're looking to get admitted to that, make sure that you apply through the Atlantic portal and not the Bahraini website. Because I made that mistake once, and if you apply through the Bahraini website, you will not be accepted. You will be waitlisted. So make sure that if you are planning to apply to Ireland or Bahrain, that you do so through the Atlantic portal website. There's also Weill Cornell. They have a Qatari campus, so that's a potential option. They do mention that you get both a Qatari and a US medical degree. In terms of Australia, there's the University of Sydney, Melbourne, Monash, Queensland, and UWA. So these are potential options. It is often reported that the Australian medical schools are cheaper relative to the US or European schools. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And again, you will be treated like an international medical graduate if you're looking to come back in Canada, same as the US. And it is an option to consider if you do not care about being a surgeon, for example, or if you're not looking to be in a competitive specialty. So most of the time, these international medical graduates come back to study or to specialize in family medicine or internal medicine. And this is something specific I want to talk about is the Caribbean schools, because I know it's a very popular option or an option that is talked about for people who are looking to go outside of Canada. And I guess I may have an unpopular opinion. No one should ever go to Caribbean schools. Caribbean schools should never be something that you consider unless you are in extreme circumstances, and I'll talk about them. Because they have similar costs, or sometimes they're a bit cheaper than being an international MD to any other country. Like you'll be paying almost similar amounts as you went to a US school, an Irish school, a Bahraini school, an Australian school. Like you'll be paying just as much. But the students often report having no support from faculty. It's very self-taught. They claim to have good education, but is not comparable to any other schools, and they have very high attrition rate. And what attrition rates mean is that they have very high failure rate. As a Caribbean MD student, you will not be provided with any support or resources. You are left on your own to study, to become good, to study the material on yourself, step one by yourself. You're not provided support systems. And so it should only be ever considered if you are able to learn independently with no help, if you have exhausted all other international options. So if you've applied to Australian schools and you're not admitted, if you applied to Irish schools and you're not admitted, Bahrain schools and you're not admitted, then perhaps you can consider Caribbean schools. If you're okay with potentially studying in a university that may lose its accreditation at any time, there's often lots of talk about how Caribbean schools are very corrupt, where they just pass anyone if they can pay for it. And so a lot of times, a lot of these schools lose their accreditation, and now you have a degree by a university that is not accredited. And they also do not have many research experience. And research experience is vital in residency in order to get accepted into these competitive specialties. So like I mentioned, if you're happy with being accepted into internal medicine or family medicine, it could be an option to consider. But in my opinion, Canadian medical schools, number one, US medical schools, number two, USDO or international are kind of like equal in my opinion, but DO schools can be better. International if you're not going to Caribbean. And the absolute last thing you should consider is international Caribbean schools. And that is in my opinion. Take it with a grain of salt. I'll briefly talk about dental schools because I know a lot of medical students are interested in dental schools. Canadian dental schools, there's not as many as medical schools, so there's only 10 schools, and 2 of them are in Ontario, U of T and Western. And the classes are extremely small and competitive to get into. And the reason it's very competitive is that there's lots of medical school rejects that are inflating the averages. Lots of medical students, lots of medical school hopeful applicants that are inflating the averages. So medical students or pre-med students who are looking to getting into medical schools with their 3.95s plus are applying to dentistry schools and are raising the averages and are making it very hard for individuals who wanted to do dental school from the beginning to get accepted. So they require their own standardized exam called the DAT, the Dental Aptitude Test. there's two versions. There's the Canadian version and there's the US version. So the Canadian version only has Chem Bio, English, and the perceptual ability test. And most schools are now requiring CASPER. Most of them do not look into your extracurriculars, but some, like the U of A, does. They used to be more forgiving with the GPA, so they used to take the best 2 years, and some of them still do, like USAS. But now a lot of them are switching into cumulative GPA because of that inflated averages, because of the medical school rejects that are inflating the averages. In terms of interviews, they both have panels and MMI formats, but usually, unlike medical schools where GPA or extracurriculars may play a bigger impact, I think I just mixed them up. Yes, sorry. Unlike medical schools where the interviews may play a very, very big role in whether you get accepted into medical school or not. So you need to do really well on your interview. In dental schools, your GPA matters more and your DAT score matters more than if you do really well on an interview or not. But check your deadlines and requirement for each school because they're usually later than they usually start after the MD school's application. One thing to know is that for dentistry, it is very expensive, around 55,000 to 65,000 per year as an in-province student, and they can even go up to $75,000 per year if you're an out-of-province student. In terms of US dental schools, their DAT is different than the Canadian DAT. So their DAT has two more sections, the quantitative reasoning and organic chemistry. These two sections are not available on the Canadian version. You can do the American version, and I know some Canadian schools will accept the American version score, but you need to look at each school's website. It's even more expensive than Canadian schools, so some of them are more expensive than out-of-province costs. So something to keep in mind. Most of them do require CASPER. It's similar application requirements as Canadian dental schools. All right, last thing I'm going to be talking about is just some frequently asked questions and myth busting, so clearing up some misconceptions. Some misconceptions about the MCAT. When do I need to take the MCAT? You can take it, I recommend taking it between the summer, between your second and third year. This allows you the opportunity to retake if you need in the following year. If you take it between your third and fourth year, you do not give yourself a chance to repeat it if you do not do well on it. Right? So, because it takes a month for your scores to come out, and usually that will be after the applications have closed. So, my recommendation is take in your first summer. So you finished first year before you start second year. Take any summer classes if you have to. The following summer, take the MCAT and study for the MCAT. Okay. How would you need to study for the MCAT? I believe you only need to take 4 months to study for the MCAT. 2 months for content review. 2 months for doing practice questions and full-length exams, but you can take longer, but it's not necessary. And if you need help coming up with a schedule on how to study for the MCAT, just message me and we can work on that. Do I need to take an MCAT course to be successful? No, they're not necessary. I did not take one, and I did quite well without it. I got the 87th percentile, 513 on my first try. The good thing about MCAT courses is that they give you a schedule. They give you a framework on what you need to do. If you're a person who needs an external force to tell them to study every day or what to study or what to do, you can take the classes, but the classes are about $3,000. And I would rather tell myself what to do than pay someone $3,000 to do it. But if you have the money, if you need that external person telling you what to study, you can take an MCAT course, but you don't need to take it to be successful. Some frequently asked questions about the CASPER. Do I need to study for the CASPER? While some people claim that they do not need to study for the CASPER, I heavily recommend at least getting some practice in. Be familiar with the questions and the answers format, how to structure your questions and the type of questions that could come up. I remember in my first year, I did not study for it and I got second quartile and I missed out on a lot of opportunities as a result of that. So you do not need to study. Some people claim that you do not need to study for it, but I recommend at least studying a bit for it. Do you need to have fast typing speeds to do well on CASPER? Definitely helps to be a fast typer, but it's not the only factor that results in getting a fourth quartile answer or fourth quartile score. But I do believe that if you have a lower than 40 words per minute, definitely do try to get some practice in to get better at typing quickly. And the good thing about Casper is that they do not take into consideration any spelling mistakes or any grammar mistakes um, when marking your answer. So as long as you're able to get the point across, you can get a high quartile. And this is, if you're familiar with Casper, there's something called the duet and the snapshot. These are like sub Casper exams. You do not need to do them. Canadian schools for now do not require them. Some US schools might require them, but in terms of Canadian schools, you do not do duet and snapshot. In terms of medical school, frequently asked questions. Do I need to move to another province in order to get into MD schools? And that is a very common question that I get asked. It used to be beneficial to move to another province in order to get IP status, like Saskatchewan, and it potentially can still be a good option if you have the money and the ability to do so. But unfortunately, a lot of provinces are now cracking down on this option. So, for example, Saskatchewan, it used to be that if you lived in Saskatchewan for 3 years, you were considered an in-province student. But now they've cracked down upon it and they've changed it where it's now next to impossible to be considered a Saskatchewan resident and be accepted into their medical school. And it's a gamble that a lot of people took. And unfortunately, we're now seeing that this gamble did not pay off as a result of that. But it's still doable. U of A, U of C, UBC, even U of M are viable options if you have the ability to do so. But keep in mind that these universities also look into your extracurriculars. So it's not enough for you to just be a resident. You also need to do extracurriculars. And if you have never lived at home, if you've never lived alone, so because it's not easy living on your own, making your own meals, keeping up with your school, extracurriculars, cleaning up the house, getting groceries, laundry. These are all things that people may not think about before moving into a different province on their own. So it's not easy, but if you're able to do so, then that can be an option to consider. It can also be very costly, and you're not guaranteed entry, like I mentioned earlier. Another question is asked is, do I need to move and take AP or IB classes to give myself an advantage when applying? No, most schools do not even consider AP or IB classes during GPA calculations. They could be beneficial if you're applying to US schools, but again, they're not necessary. The reason why you would do an AP class is if you were hoping to get accepted into a specific program in the US, especially in the Ivy Leagues. But for Canada, you do not need to take AP classes. And in terms of AP classes, they're essentially university classes that you would do in high school. And the reason I do not really recommend them much is that this mark will stick with you in university for schools that do count them in your transcripts. If you did not do well in high school when you took that AP class, that could potentially be a disadvantage and a detriment to your overall GPA. But luckily, most schools do not consider them. So why even bother and put yourself through that risk? I do not believe that taking AP or IB classes will give you any advantage. One more, let's see. What undergraduate degree should I do if I want to do medicine in the future? Kinesiology, always. I'll always recommend kinesiology. I'm joking. But no, seriously, I think kinesiology is a very, very good program to take. Definitely the number one program is health sciences at McMaster if you're able to do so. It's a very difficult program, but it is known as the pre-medicine program because almost 66% of students who get accepted into that program go on to medical school. And an even crazier statistic is that it's a 4-year program, but most of their students by 3rd year get accepted into medical school. So it is, for some reason, I don't know how to get accepted, so I can't speak too much on it, but it is for some reason known as the program to get accepted into medical school. It is not easy to get accepted into that program, but if you're able to do so and you get accepted, this should be your only option. But seriously, on a more serious note, get into any program that you know that you can do well on and you can get high grades in. It does not matter if it's in music, it does not matter if it's history, it does not matter a history degree, a science degree, a biology degree. As long as you know you can do well on and you can get high grades in, that's a good program. But there are degrees that are easier than others. And an example of that is a kinesiology degree. And the reason I believe that it's a very good degree to take is because it's an extremely easy degree. Like, I'll be the first one to admit that kinesiology compared to biology or chemistry or physics degrees, it's a super chill and easy degree. Like, it's very hands-on. It offers opportunities for individuals, like unique individual experiences for individuals, both during the degree and other options for you to consider after your degree. So you can take that kinesiology degree and apply to physio school, OT school, personal training if medicine does not work out for you, or you decide you do not want to do medicine, versus bio degrees or chemistry degrees where the only really job prospects that you have is research or consulting services. And so I'm very biased towards kinesiology degrees. Not all kinesiology degrees are easy, of course. Like, for example, UTM can or UFT can is not exactly the easiest, but in my opinion, it is way more easier compared to a program like bio or chemistry or organic chemistry. And if you know that you would not enjoy kinesiology and would rather stick to a traditional degree, then that always works. You just have to work harder. I'm sorry to say. But one thing to keep in mind is that university name and your reputation does not matter. Do not listen to your parent who's trying to tell you go to UTM or go to UFT because UFT is a well-known name. UFT students are known to have bad time when it comes to getting high grades or getting good grades. And one thing to keep in mind, which I did not write here and I just remembered, is that the way Ontario converts, because each school has their own different grading scale. If you notice, some do percentages, some do out of 4, some do out of 4.5. So for most schools, like the Ontario Services, for example, they standardized a way to convert everyone's grade into a standardized GPA. And as a result of that, unfortunately, some schools have it more favorable than others. For example, in Saskatchewan, I'm a student from Saskatchewan and I'm looking to apply to an Ontario school, an 80 to an 84 is considered a 3.7, an 85 to an 89 is considered a 3.9, and anything above a 90 is considered a 4.0. So if I get 90, I get 95, if I can get 99, it's all 4.0 in Ontario's eyes. Versus a student who went to York, for example, where an A plus is a 4.0 and an A is a 3.7. So essentially, if you go to York U, for example, for your bachelor's degree, you need to get A pluses in essentially everything because one A can bring your GPA down very heavily. And I just showed you that GPA is king when it comes to these universities. One 3.7 can bring down your overall GPA a lot. And that is why it's important to also make sure that you go to a university that where if you were to convert your grades, it would not be as detrimental. And if you need more information on that, I can explain it to you more in private. So again, university name or reputation does not matter when it comes to Canadian medical schools, as long as it's a Canadian accredited school and not a college. All right, a couple last questions. Should I do a master's if I did not get in after graduation? I do not think there's a definitive answer, but it is situation dependent. But keep these factors in mind. If you start a master's degree, you have to finish it before applying to medical schools. Med schools, like McMaster, for example, hate it if you're in a research-based master's and you decide to apply halfway through. You need to finish these 2 years of master's before applying to medical school. Some schools will not even allow you to apply if you're a master's student. Some master's degree are 1 year, but they are expensive, so that's something to keep in mind. And your master's degree marks will be considered when applying. And that can either be a positive or a negative thing. If you did not do well in your bachelor's degree, taking a master's degree could perhaps be could be a positive because it would help raise your GPA. But if you are a person who did not do well in their master's, then that can either bring your GPA down as well. So it's a two-way street. And it could be a solid backup option if you're not sure about continuing in medicine. So I know a lot of my friends who are not sure, who did not get accepted, enrolled in a master's of public health. And that could be a very good option to consider if you're not too sure about medicine. If you don't get accepted, you're not too sure about pursuing a career in medicine, because a master's in public health allows you to work in healthcare adjacent fields and healthcare adjacent positions that still provides you with the ability to work in a hospital and, I guess, do good in the world while not being as rigorous as medical school if you do not get accepted into it. And another question is, should I take a gap year if I did not get in after graduation? And it's similar to a master's. There's no definitive answer. But if you're going to sit at home and do nothing all day, then no, do a master's, do something useful with your time. But if you're going to use that time to work, to travel, to engage in more extracurriculars, then perhaps it could help you improve on the lacking aspects of your application, especially if you already have the stats to get in. If you already have a high GPA, high MCAT, you know you can do well, but for some reason your extracurriculars are lacking, then you can take that gap year to get involved uh, in an organization, or even make your own organization, develop a business, work in your field. That would help boost your application. And a lot of schools are starting to like the fact that people are taking gap year to work on themselves and then apply to medical schools. So yeah, that's just a couple of FAQs. Oh, we're still going. When should I consider applying internationally? So obviously Canada is notoriously bad when it comes to admitting students. It's not impossible. If you have a high GPA, especially in the 3.85 plus and a high MCAT, so around 510 plus, especially if you have high cars. If you have a high cars, please do not leave Canada. You can definitely get into Canadian medical school, okay? And you're able to get a high CASPER score, so in the third or the fourth quartile, then you should continue trying in Canada. Um, Unfortunately, Canada is very luck dependent, right? But if you already have the stats, then it is, in my personal opinion, that you should stay in Canada. Okay, moving abroad will make your life very difficult. You likely will not be able to match in competitive specialties like surgery, anesthesiology, radiology, etc. And you would either have to match in internal medicine or family medicine. So if you're content with that, or if you're even content with the fact that you might have to live in the US and work there, or in Ireland or whatever, then international schools could be an option. But if you have the stats, please stay in Canada. And so if you have the mid stats and have tried applying to Canadian medical schools with no luck, and you're happy with the possibility of not being able to practice in Canada, then applying abroad could be an option. That is it from me. If you have any other questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. And please, if you have the time, take the time to fill out this form. It just helps me, gives me feedback on this whole session in general, what I can do to improve upon. And if you're interested in receiving private tutoring, obviously for a fee, or counseling for a fee, please fill out this form or reach out to my email or my phone number. Other than that, I'll stay for maybe 5 more minutes. If anyone has any questions, I'll answer them. That's it from me. Uh, Abdullah, if you can type your question, that would be better. Let me see if I can. You can unmute if you want to. Okay. Well, like I mentioned, thank you all for joining. I hope I've at least helped one of you in their quest to become a medical student. And again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. And yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.